The theater lights were blinding, but for Jessica Sanchez, the world still felt dark. At 19, she carried memories heavier than her years, barefoot afternoons selling broomsticks, nights when hunger sang louder than lullabies, mornings when silence replaced breakfast. And now, here she was, standing before judges, cameras, and millions unseen. Her trembling fingers gripped the microphone as though it were the last piece of hope she had left to hold. Each step to center stage echoed with sacrifices, her mother stitching clothes past midnight, her father lowering his eyes at school meetings, ashamed of unpaid fees. Jessica's dream was fragile, carried quietly like a secret too sacred to expose. She whispered a prayer under her breath, recalling her grandmother's words, "Child, the world does not hear the poor, unless you teach it to listen." The crowd hushed. Sofia Vergara leaned forward, sensing something unspoken in the way Jessica stood, fragile, yet unbroken. The music began, soft but steady, inviting her to leap or falter. Jessica closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and let the first note escape. It wasn't just singing, it was confession, it was survival clothed in melody. The stage dissolved into images of her childhood, the crowded alley, the dim kitchen, her grandmother's gentle lap. Each note carried sorrow, but also defiance. And in that breathtaking instant, the world leaned closer, listening, her voice rose, trembling yet unyielding, carrying with it years of hidden hunger and unspoken prayers. Jessica wasn't simply performing, she was bleeding her story into song. Each lyric was stitched with memories of sacrifice. The audience could not see the bruises on her palms from scrubbing floors, nor the countless evenings she skipped meals so her younger brother could eat. But they felt it. Every note was soaked in authenticity, the kind no studio or training could ever create. The judges exchanged glances, startled by the rawness. This wasn't polished entertainment, it was truth, sung from a place too deep for rehearsals. Backstage, Jessica's mother wept, clutching a worn rosary between trembling fingers. She whispered the same prayer she had whispered through storms, sickness, and debts too heavy to speak aloud. Nearby, her father stood apart, hands clenched, recalling the day he pawned his wedding ring so Jessica could buy her first pair of shoes. The song climbed into its final verse, fragile yet soaring, like a candle refusing to be blown out. Jessica's voice cracked, not from weakness, but from honesty, and then grew into a sound that filled the entire hall like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The last note lingered in the air, suspended, shimmering. Silence followed, thick, sacred, unbroken. For a heartbeat, even the cameras seemed to hold still, unwilling to disturb the fragile magic. And then it came, thunderous applause, a tidal wave of clapping hands and standing feet. Jessica gasped, covering her face in disbelief, her body trembling with gratitude and shock. For the first time in her life, the echoes of sacrifice did not disappear into silence. They returned as recognition. They returned as honor. The auditorium seemed frozen, still echoing with Jessica's final trembling note. Sofia Vergara leaned forward, her hands pressed against her chest, eyes shimmering with tears she tried to hide. For a heartbeat, she didn't speak. Words felt too small for what had just unfolded. The other judges exchanged subtle nods, moved in ways they rarely revealed, but Sofia's gaze never left Jessica. She didn't just see a singer, she saw a story, a legacy of quiet endurance, a soul that had refused to break despite everything stacked against it. The audience was still on its feet, roaring with applause, but inside that noise, a softer current moved, a recognition that something sacred had just happened. Sofia blinked rapidly, then leaned toward her microphone. "This," she whispered, voice trembling, "is not just talent. This is truth. And truth deserves to be heard." Her hand rose slowly, hovering above the golden buzzer. The crowd erupted, sensing the moment. Jessica froze, her breath catching, her eyes wide with disbelief. And then, Sofia pressed it. A storm of golden confetti burst into the air, cascading down like sunlight made visible. Jessica collapsed to her knees, sobs breaking free as the weight of years lifted under that glittering rain. She pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed, trembling not from fear but from wonder. Backstage, her mother screamed her name, rushing forward with tears streaming. Her father followed, unsteady but proud, his hands shaking as he clutched his daughter's dream becoming real before his eyes. Jessica lifted her face heavenward through the golden haze, whispering to her grandmother's memory, "You were right. They're listening now." The theater thundered with love. A miracle had taken shape before millions. When the stage lights dimmed and the confetti settled, Jessica expected joy to stay. But shadows arrived quickly, creeping in through careless whispers. Backstage, she overheard voices slicing through her fragile euphoria, "She's just a sympathy act." Another muttered, "The golden buzzer was pity, not talent." Their words pierced deeper than poverty ever had. She lowered her gaze, hugging her knees, the confetti still tangled in her hair, a cruel reminder of how quickly celebration could turn into suspicion. Doubt spread inside her chest like wildfire. Was her voice enough? Was it real? Or had the world simply clapped for her pain? The thought clawed at her, threatening to unravel the fragile belief she had just begun to hold. Her father noticed. For years, silence had been his shield, but this time, he could not stay quiet. He walked over, sat beside her, and after a long pause, spoke words he had hidden for far too long. "Jessica. Don't measure yourself by the smallness of their hearts. The world will always doubt what it cannot understand. But tonight, you gave us dignity. And no one can take that away." His voice cracked, unfamiliar with carrying pride. Jessica looked at him, stunned. This was the man who had always hidden his shame, who had pawned his ring in silence, who had walked away from school meetings unable to face the stairs. And now, he was telling her she was enough. Tears filled her eyes, not from doubt anymore, but from recognition. Her pain had never been weakness, it was inheritance. It was her story. And maybe, just maybe, it was the very thing that could turn silence into song for others too afraid to speak. The days after the golden buzzer were a blur of cameras, interviews, and rehearsals. But for Jessica, the spotlight was not comfort, it was responsibility. She knew the confetti would fade, the applause would quiet, and only her truth would remain. Each rehearsal became a prayer, every note carrying both gratitude and burden. She no longer sang only for a stage, she sang for every unseen child sweeping streets, for every parent sacrificing silently. Producers offered her coaches, stylists, gowns shimmering under bright lights. But Jessica shook her head gently. She wanted to wear the same hand-sewn dress her mother had stitched, its threads thin but strong. "I want them to see where I come from," she explained. To her, that dress was not weakness, it was her banner of resilience. Something shifted around her. Contestants who had once seen her as competition began gravitating toward her presence. They saw not rivalry, but quiet courage. One night, during a late rehearsal, another singer approached her, eyes glistening. "I almost quit," they admitted softly. "But watching you reminded me why I started." Jessica's smile trembled. She realized her voice was already doing more than chasing victory. It was giving others permission to hope again. On the eve of the live show, Jessica stood alone in the empty theater. She looked out at rows of seats her family once could never afford. Slowly, she began to sing, not for judges, not for cameras, but for her grandmother's memory, for her younger brother's future, for the barefoot girl she had once been. When the last note echoed back to her in the silence, she whispered, "This is not survival anymore. This is purpose." The night of the finals arrived, heavy with anticipation. Jessica stood beneath the dazzling lights once more, her heart steady this time, no longer trembling like before. The music began, and her voice rose, clear, strong, carrying the weight of every sacrifice her family had endured. Each lyric rang like an anthem, not of victory, but of survival transformed into hope. By the final note, the judges were weeping openly, the audience stood holding strangers' hands, and for a moment, the theater itself felt like a cathedral of humanity. The ovation was deafening, but what came next was softer, deeper. As Jessica walked off stage, Sofia Vergara embraced her tightly and whispered, "Your voice is a gift, but your story is greater. Whatever happens tonight, remember, your family's sacrifices are now your crown." Weeks later, Jessica did not win the trophy. Yet when she returned home, something extraordinary awaited. Neighbors gathered outside her small house, cheering her name. Letters poured in, scholarships, invitations, opportunities. But the truest miracle was closer. Her father, once silent and ashamed, now walked proudly beside her, introducing her as, "My daughter, the singer." The story came full circle on a quiet afternoon at her younger brother's graduation. Jessica stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. Inside his diploma cover, she had carefully tucked a piece of golden confetti from that unforgettable night. With tears in her eyes, she whispered, "This is why I sang."